The creator of the universe evidently wanted us to study the heavens because he has made half the time the world around us completely black, meaning we cannot navigate around it or seek food or accomplish anything. It's as if to draw our attention to the skies, to say that look at this spectacle of lights, these thousand sparkling lights that has been placed on the canvas of the heavens. It wants to draw your attention. Your attention is drawn there by their intrinsic beauty, and all the more so by the impossibility of accomplishing anything on the earthly plane during this time of or half the time of our existence, the nighttime. So, indeed, ancient man did pursue the study of the heavens in great detail from an early point in time. It would, be an insult to the creator not to do so, since it is set up in this fashion. So, when you study the heavens, you soon discover that indeed the heavens have a great influence on earthly affairs. So, for instance, the most obvious is indicator obviously is the sun, which controls the seasons, the day and night, the life of the plants, all these things. Well, that's clear to anybody. And then we have the moon also has strong effects, like the tides, ebb and flow of the sea. This is determined by the phases of the moon. This is quite clear. If you live in a coastal area, you're going to pick up this correlation pretty quickly. Likewise, the fertility of women is tied to the phases of the moon also. So, the menstrual cycle matches the cycle of the moon. So that is likewise an indication of the heavens being in control of what happens on Earth. And other indications are given by these quotations that I have put over here in the right-hand column. They are basically kind of rules of thumb for how to live your life in these ancient manuals or almanacs that are rules to live by at that time. So we see the first statement says 50 days after the solstice is the right time for men to go sailing. So it's basically it pinpoints a particular time of year, the time most fruitful for sailing by means of some astronomical occurrence like the solstice and so. So something that you determine by looking at the heavens. That's how you determine the time of year most appropriate for one activity or another. Just like the second quotation over here says the same thing. It says, when strong Orion begins to set, then remember to plow. So that is, if you're a farmer, also you need to look at the sky in order to determine what time of year to do this or that or the other thing. And, strong Orion is the name then given to a particular configuration of stars. This is what the star map over here on the left is showing. That obviously ancient man looking at the night sky with all its myriad of stars, studying these things in great detail and using a bit of imagination, you can begin to see certain patterns and identify clusters of stars as the image of some particular object or other, or like Orion in this case. So, and those stars then are visible certain times of the year and not other times of the year, because the sun, the light from the sun kind of drowns out half the sky with its overwhelming power. So even though there are stars, also in principle during the day, there are stars behind the blue sky, but of course the sunlight is too powerful for us to see. So therefore, at any given point of the year, half the stars of the sky are going to be visible at night, and the other half is going to be hidden in the light of the sun during the day. So when you say something like when strong Orion begins to set, that you're referring to the fact that Orion is passing from the visible part of the sky to the invisible part of the sky, the part of the sky that is drowned out by the light of the sun, so you can't observe it anymore. So that is basically a way of pinpointing a time of year for which as we can understand today, is very important occurrence, even though we would not necessarily think of it as the constellation Orion itself having a kind of causal influence on the world. Nevertheless, it is we understand how one could reach such a conclusion, because it is indeed the case with agriculture or sailing and those kinds of things, that you need to coordinate those kinds of actions with specific times of the year. So the rationale here is clear enough. And so this explains, then these kinds of examples explain how the heavens have a clear influence on what happens on Earth. Now I want to go one step further, which is to argue that also the personalities of us all is determined by the heavens at the time of our birth. So that's, the classic birth chart astrology or horoscopes and these things. So what's the rationale behind that? How do you reach that point by reasoning along these kinds of lines? Well, a powerful argument for that is given by Plato. Here we have this passage from Plato at top here reads, "Self-motion is the very idea and essence of the soul. The body which is moved from without is soulless, but that which is moved from within has a soul." So, indeed, I have some, on the right here, I have put some visual indication of some objects which are moved from without. That is to say, objects that cannot move of their own accord, but only move if you kind of push or pull or something. Like, for example, the cart obviously is not going to go because it wants to go. It only goes because you pull it, or you have to apply force to it for it to move. And even the things like the rain or the wind and stuff like that are also not moving out of their own accord. The pieces of water do not have the ability to ascend into the heavens and fall back down again out of their own intrinsic will. Rather, these things are determined by ultimately the sun, because of the sun heats up certain parts of the earth, not others, causing differences in air pressure, differences in condensation and all these kinds of things. And that's why we have wind and rain and so really all those things just come from the sun, and they're not moving out of their own accord. So they go in the right hand column, moved from without. They're external factors that make these things move. Then we have the left hand column, things that move by themselves from within. They are moved out of their own accord, as if they can move at will. And obviously that includes us, people, can move as we wish without being pushed by any external. We don't need an external engine to make that happen. And likewise, it includes also the planets, the heavenly bodies. They can move of their own accord. They are moving all the time, circling us above, and they are the prototype of self-motion in that regard. They are just as if they were made to move. It's part of this kind of essence that they go around and around and around. So therefore you might say this fact that the only thing that possess the capacity for self-motion are planets and beings with a soul. That establishes a strong kinship between beings with the soul and the heavens, suggesting that in fact you could say that maybe all objects on Earth would be completely inanimate if it wasn't for the heavens at all. And the fact that some beings can move at their own accord is an indication that they have a piece of the heavens implanted in their soul. Our souls are kind of piece, stardust, as it were, that gives us, the capacity for self-motion has been transferred from the heavens down into earthly beings in this fashion. It's a striking dichotomy indeed between objects that can move, that have a soul, and the other. So, it's a strong indication, or it's a compelling argument for why indeed the soul of man is a piece of the heavens that has been implanted in him. So, for the purposes of horoscopes, we must think of it like this. We have the Earth here in the center of the solar system, and we have the various planets layered outside of it like this. And we must think of the moment of birth as a moment where a soul is brought down through these layers of the various planets, and then is pinned into a corporeal body down here at Earth. So it's not such a crazy idea then that in fact uh, the positions of the planets at the time of our birth are have an influence on our personality, since indeed our soul has passed through all these layers and picked up properties from each of them before it is planted in our body at birth. So that's the rationale for thinking that personalities are determined by the positions of the heavenly bodies at the time of our birth. And so, what are the personalities of the different heavenly bodies then that they impart? You get something from one planet and something from the other, and so in this way you interpret the personality of is determined by the position of these various planets. That I'm going to argue now, even that makes also a lot of sense. The personalities of the various heavenly bodies makes also a lot of sense. And in order to study these properties, I'm going to quote to you the descriptions of the personalities of the heavenly bodies given by the second century astrologer here, Vettius Valens. So this is just a mainstream expression of mainstream astrology. It's an ancient source giving us a standard opinion on the personality of the heavenly bodies. These kinds of characterizations of the personalities of heavenly bodies was very much a standard matter. So first we begin with the sun here. Let's see, I'll read this quotation and we'll see if we can understand why indeed the sun should be associated with this personality type. So this ancient source says, "The sun is the overseer of all. He is fiery. He is the light of the intellect and the instrument of the soul's perception. In a horoscope, he indicates kingship, leadership, the father, the master." Okay, does it make sense? I would say so. The sun is clearly fiery. I mean, that's evident enough. And he's a light of the intellect, an instrument of the soul's perception. Something can be clear as day, we say. That means that the light of the sun, the clarity of the light of the sun is what makes us see things clearly. So it makes sense to associate the sun with clarity of insight and perception in that way. He indicates kingship, leadership. Obviously, is a very powerful ruling heavenly body. The father, of course, is also the father of all plants, for example. That's like we already noted. So all of these properties make a lot of sense. So astrology is not just something that some guy made up arbitrarily, but rather it has a lot of sense to it. With just a little bit of poetic imagination, you can easily ascribe all these personality traits to the sun. Well, what about the other planets? The moon, for example. The moon indicates human life at birth, the body, the mother, nurture, housekeeping, the queen, the mistress. All of these things I quote from this ancient source, and they're all easily rationalized in terms of what we already said, that the moon, phases of the moon are coordinated with the menstrual cycle and therefore fertility of women. So that immediately leads us to all of these associating the moon with all these personality traits. It's quite a natural step to take. Let's consider next Venus. The planet Venus, it is desire and erotic love. I'm quoting now again, of course. Desire and erotic love. She indicates the mother and the nurturer. She causes reconciliations for good ends, marriages, refined arts and crafts, good singing voices, music, sweetness and melody, beauty of form, painting, and so on. So Venus is beauty, indeed, the goddess of beauty. And what exactly is the rationale for that? It was a little bit less evident than the case of the sun and the moon here. Nevertheless, uh, it is also perfectly understandable in my opinion. Namely, if we look at the this arrangement of the solar system that I have displayed here in this picture, I have used obviously the modern or arrangement with the sun in the middle here, and the Earth orbiting around it, which is not the way these ancient people were considering the matter, but doesn't really matter. But the important point, though, for these purposes, which you can see clearly in this when you look at the solar system this way, is the fact that Venus is always pretty close to the sun, and that's the crucial point for the purposes of this explanation. So Venus, you can visualize yourself in this picture that no matter where Venus is on its orbit here, it's always going to be more or less in the vicinity of the sun, a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left, but basically in around the sun as seen from the Earth. Whereas the outer planets, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, they can be anywhere. They can be completely opposite side from the sun, which Venus could never be because it's orbiting the sun and is very close to it. So what does that mean in practical terms? It means that Venus is only visible during sunrise and sunset. Only around sunrise and sunset are the only times you can ever observe Venus, because during the day the sun will be high in the sky, Venus will be right around it somewhere, but you can't see it obviously because it's right in the area around the sun and it's going to be drowned out by the light of the sun, so you cannot observe Venus during those times. And likewise, in the middle of the night, the sun will have set long ago, so it's going to be way below the horizon. But then Venus, which is never far from the sun, is going to have gone with it and also be far below the horizon, so you can't observe it in middle of the night either. So you end up with the state of affairs that the only time you can observe Venus is right after the sun has set, when it's just dark enough to start to see other things, but before Venus has also set, which you can set quick right after it. So you have a little window opportunity there to observe Venus, and likewise when the sun is rising the other way around, you have an opportunity to observe Venus. So how is this business going to lead me to the personality here about desire and erotic love? What I just described explains that Venus is associated with sunrise and sunset. Sunrise and sunset obviously are very beautiful natural events. They are obviously very sensual, almost erotic, one might say. So because Venus is associated with those times of day, it's very natural to give Venus this personality, to associate Venus with desire, erotic love, and so on. So, that again is not an arbitrary invention, these personalities of the planets, but rather something that makes a lot of sense, and it comes about very naturally. So if we move to Mercury, which is inside in the modern arrangement of the solar system, we think of Mercury as being inside of Venus there in a smaller circle, and that is indeed the basis for understanding the personality that is assigned to Mercury. We can read here that in the standardization conception of the planetary system, I quote, Mercury indicates education, letters, argumentation, logic, brotherhood, calculations, geometry, commerce, youth, play, discoveries. He is the giver of discernment and judgment. He is in charge of brothers and younger children. Well, how can we understand that in terms of what I just described, in terms of the astronomical properties of the planet Mercury? Well, certainly is a very youthful, younger children kind of planet, because it's the younger children of Venus. It's like a little brother of Venus, so to speak, because he is smaller, quicker, because it's closer to the sun. It's going to move faster, so it's a little buzzing around like a bee, like a young child playing around there. So that makes a lot of sense. And also, all of this business about being associated with education and discernment and these things it has to do with the fact that Venus or Mercury is very difficult to observe. What I said about Venus uh, being visible only around sunrise and sunset, it applies all the more so to Mercury because it's even closer to the sun. So that gives us an even smaller window of opportunity to be able to observe Mercury. You only have like a tiny possibility right after the sun is setting. You have a small chance to see Mercury, and then boop, it's gonna set also very quickly. So you have to, or the same as sunrise. So you have to look at those. If you want to observe Mercury, you're going to have to be very precise. You have to know what you're looking for, and you have to be very attentive at one particular moment. And therefore, Mercury is the planet of discernment, letters, logic, and argumentation, and so on, because only these kinds of discerning astronomers who are devoted to study and careful logic and argumentation, only those kinds of people will ever observe Mercury, and ordinary people can never see it because it's so difficult to catch. So that also explains why Mercury has those properties. Very well. On the other side of Venus, we have Mars. The other side, seen from the Earth, that is. And indeed, that explains why Mars is the opposite of Venus. It's just Venus inverted. Venus is the femininity embodied, so Mars is masculinity. Here is the quotation. Mars indicates violence, wars, plundering, uproar, excess, adultery, masculinity, perjury, error, negotiations on bad terms. Those who work with fire and iron, artisans, masons, he makes military commanders. You see, those are all, it's anti-Venus, basically, is how you can characterize Mars. So the kind of hot-headed masculinity caricature is associated with Mars, and it's because it's the opposite side of Venus. It's the opposite of Venus, quite simply. It's how its personality is defined. So that also is something that we can easily understand in terms of the astrological, in terms of the just astronomical objective facts about Mars. We can infer its personality like this. And if we look to Saturn, uh, Saturn is the outermost planet, and because it's the outermost and it's furthest away, means it's pretty slow. Also, the slowest planet, it has a big, long way to go around, and those properties explain why this personality is assigned to it. So we read here the personality of Saturn. Saturn makes those born under him solitary, robed in black. He causes laziness, inactivity, hindrance, long drawn out litigation. He makes tax collectors. He brings things to completion. He makes people single or widowed, orphaned or childless. Yeah, this all is just what we described, that Saturn is the last planet. So it is the planet that doesn't have any children, and it's also the planet that is, delineates the rules, like a tax collector, this and no further. It means this is the end of the world. So the Saturn is a very rule bound planet that delineates, that draws the boundaries, and is also dark and slow because it's so far away. So all of those things make a lot of sense. Likewise, then we have Jupiter. Jupiter, according to the ancient source here that I'm quoting from, Jupiter indicates abundance, salaries, large gifts, good crop yields, justice, rulership, release from chains, and freedom. All of these things are quite easy to understand in terms of the astronomical properties of Jupiter, because it is the largest planet. This drawing is not really all that great, but Jupiter is really very big. It's not to scale here, but Jupiter is a massive planet, and because it's reasonably far away, also it's fairly slow. So it's big and slow, and it's kind of majestic almost. Doesn't need to listen to anybody. It's free from chains because it's so massive and self-sufficient. So it has also indicates then abundance and good crop yields, and so justice or rulership. It's a very majestic planet, so it's associated with those properties. Well, that's it then. I have now summarized the personalities of all the heavenly bodies known to man at the time in terms of the just common sense astrological reasoning, really. Okay, now I wanted to apply this to how would one use this to interpret the personality of a person on the basis of their horoscope, on the basis of where the planets stood when they were born. I use myself as an indication here. This is my own horoscope birth chart. So you can see the basic idea then is to position the various planets where they stood when I was born relative to the stars. That is what has been done here in this diagram. The moment of my birth, this is what the heavens looked like seen from the place where I was born. And so for example, the sun, you can see the sun is indicated with this red circle with the dot in the middle, and you can find him down at the bottom of all these various symbols, and he's located in the sign of the zodiac, which is the Pisces. So that's the star sign in which I was born, which that's the kind of popular astrology obviously associates the sign of the zodiac based on where the star, based on where the sun stood when you were born, which is to say what time of year you were born. So, but that's pretty boring. You know, a more fascinating conclusion we can read off here using the personalities of the planets that we studied on the previous screens is look at the top of all the top up here of these various planetary arrangements, and you will find that Saturn and Mars are the two topmost planets, and they're standing virtually on top of each other. So you have Saturn and your Mars here in my horoscope colliding almost. They are conjunct, as we say. I have a Mars-Saturn conjunct in my horoscope, meaning the two are on top of each other, and that means that they become mixed. Conjunct is a negative aspect, you say. You don't really want your planets to be conjunct in your horoscope. You don't want the thing to be one on top of the other, because then they clash and you end up with mixing these two properties in an unfavorable way. So you might say that in terms of my personality, for example, Mars represents then the traditional masculinity element, which you could say I lack this because I have too much Saturn, which is Saturn is the outermost planet, the planet that limits everything, the planet of solitary, this and that, and so on. So the Saturn is then limiting my Mars, as it were, holding back my natural masculinity. Or it makes a lot of sense in terms of my personality. You know, I'm kind of a bit of a nerd type, and I was never very good at sports, you know, this kind of stuff. Maybe it's because of the Saturn holding back my Mars. That's the explanation for that. And likewise, the other way around. In Saturn, which is the planet of tax collector and reasonable boundaries and so on, the Saturn sets the boundary at the end of the solar system. But me, you see, I often overstep boundaries and sense in this kind of context when I'm supposed to act like a tax collector. You know, in the academic world of today, you are often expected to be basically a kind of tax collector, you know, play by the rules, know where the limits are drawn, like a good Saturn should. But me, I am not of that character. If you read my book reviews or something, you can see I'm always full of antagonism. I was like, oh, it's all almost like a big warfare to me to do this kind of academic work, you know, where other people would emphasize the tax collector nature of the work. Academic work is very dry, very impersonal, like a tax collector, or you have to know the appropriate boundaries, like those kinds of things would be associated with Saturn. But I have too much Mars in my Saturn. I have too much aggression, warfare coming in those overriding those the places where I ought to know the boundaries of things and ought to be able to act like a tax collector. So that is how, for example, I would indicate then some aspects of my personality on the basis of my horoscope. So I just do this for fun here as a little indication to give a flavor of astrological reasoning for your amusement. In any case, my main point then has been to prove that astrological reasoning has a lot of sense and reason to it, and it's people did not believe in astrology for thousands of years because they were crazy and nuts, but because certainly you can see very compelling reasons for why it made a lot of sense indeed. So such has been my argument. Thank you.